Hello everyone, and welcome back to another tutorial in our series Data as Material. So in this week's lessons, we're gonna be looking at bringing data into our p5.js sketches from spreadsheets. So we're gonna do a few examples. We're gonna start with a very basic one, how to open a spreadsheet in p5.js and then make something with the data. And then in the other examples this week, we're also going to tackle the idea of working with coordinates. A lot of the data you might run into out there has geographic coordinates as part of it. So we're also going to talk about in this week's series of lessons, how do we convert from latitude, longitude coordinates into pixels on the screen. But first, let's jump right into it and start talking about working with spreadsheets. So I've already remixed the p5.js blank sketch here, just so we have a fresh program to get started. And in this week's example, we're going to look at working specifically with Google Spreadsheets. But everything we do, we could also do using files that you could upload to your sketch. I just find working with Google Spreadsheets is a little bit more convenient because if you decide to change your data, it will update automatically. You don't have to re-upload a file. So in order to walk through this first lesson, we need some kind of data to work with. So this is a Google Docs here. I've already have a couple spreadsheets for the other examples, but we're going to make a brand new one for this lesson. Let's call it colors. So we're going to be pretty straightforward here for this first example. We just need some data to work with. So let's go grab some online. So let's grab some data here from this Reddit poll on favorite colors. So this was 2,796 respondents voted on what their favorite color is, and it's like more or less consistent with what is generally found to be the favorite color for most people. Like blue tends to win. In this case, in this Redditor poll here, green came out on top, but it's not really important. We just need some data to work with. I think it's shared as an CSV file, which stands for comma separated value. But just to keep things simple, we're just going to grab these results here, and that's going to be the data we're going to put into our spreadsheet just for our demonstration. So I'm going to grab this, and I'm going to copy this here into the spreadsheet. Now, this is created some spaces over there, so I don't want that. Now, of course, you can be making your own data set, or you might find a data set online that you want to work with. All of this will work the same. So here are my numbers are stuck into one column, so we're just going to quickly split that. We're going to use split text to columns, and we're going to use spaces. Perfect. And so what we have here is each row has a color and a percentage. So this was the percentage of respondents that chose that color as their favorite color. And it's a percentage, but just to make our lives a little bit easier in the code, I want to represent this as a decimal number. I mean, as a number between 0 and 1, right? So this is a number between 0 and 100. So if we represent it as a number between 0 and 1, we can divide by 100, right? So this becomes, so this is the same. This is also a percentage, and this way of representing it is easier because I can just multiply that by some other number to scale it. All right, so really quickly here, just building a table that we can work with. I'm going to copy this, paste it as values only, and now I can delete the calculation over here. Okay. Anyways, that's not the point of this week's lesson, but now we have a little bit to work with. So the way we access these spreadsheets from p5.js is using a function called loadTable. So loadTable here, let's bring up the reference. So loadTable takes a couple of parameters, but primarily it opens something called a CSV file. So CSV stands for comma separated values. CSV file will have kind of this format internally. So each row of the spreadsheet is going to be represented by a row in the file, and the columns are separated using commas, hence comma separated values. So the loadTable function, it takes a CSV file as its input, and then gives us an object called a table object that we can use within our code. Now, like I mentioned in the beginning, this CSV file can be a file that we literally upload to our sketch. So we could, for example, download this spreadsheet we made as a CSV, right, comma separated value. This would give me a file that I can download. Then I could upload it here to my assets in the sketch, right? I could put it into my assets. And from there, I could do load tables. But with Google Sheets, we can do a neat trick where we're going to publish the data to the web. So when we publish to the web, what we're going to get is a live link that is basically a CSV file that can be downloaded sort of on the fly. So when we want to publish our spreadsheet, I'm going to select here just the first sheet, not the entire document. And I'm going to select comma separated value as the format. You can also set some parameters on access and so forth. We'll make this one public for the purposes of this demo. So I'm going to hit publish here. It's going to start publishing the spreadsheet that I'm working on. And this is giving me a URL here. So this is a link. I'm going to copy this link here. And now this points to the CSV version of the data contained in the spreadsheet. And as we update it, it will also update the one that's being published. So so we can see what we get, if I put this into a browser and just click on the link here, this will download a CSV file, right? And I could open it here in Excel, and we can see this is the data that I had compiled as a CSV file. So this is a live link that we can use. We can download it, but we can also use it straight into our code. So let's start our example by creating a variable. We're going to call it data. So this is the variable that's going to contain our data table object. And we're also going to make a variable here called URL. And here I'm going to paste, it's going to be quite long here. I'm going to paste the link to the Google spreadsheet I just published. Okay, so I just grabbed that in just a few seconds ago. Okay. Now we could go and set up here and create the table, but depending on how big the table is, some data tables can get pretty large. It might take a little bit of time for the file to download and to actually get be available to our code. So P5 has a function that you can implement called preload. So preload's purpose is, like the name says, is to load assets, image files, sound files, data files before your sketch actually runs. So this is a little bit of code that's going to run before setup. And the only thing you ever want to put into preload is load type functions. So here we're going to do a load table, and we're going to put our URL as the first parameter. We could have also just put the string right here if we wanted to, but I find that's a little bit cleaner to keep a variable separate at the top here for the URL, and then just refer to that variable when we load the table. And then the second parameter will be the type of data contained inside the table. P5 can load a few formats. CSV is the main one. You can also have semicolon separated value or tab separated value, so you might run into these other files. If you're creating the file yourself or you have access to it in Google Docs, then you might as well export as CSV. Okay. All right, so now we can see it's loading the table. And there's a little bit of extra time now in the beginning that says loading because it now has to run this function. Then it's going to jump into setup. Okay, so what can we do with this table object? Well, one of the things I like to do when let's say I'm learning a library or I'm trying to figure out something I haven't done before with JavaScript, I like to rely on the console quite a bit to explore the objects that I have to play with. So let's open developer tools here. And what we want to do now is we want to have access, we want to explore this variable that we just got in preload. Now, if I put in data here, the console doesn't actually have any idea what I'm talking about. And that's because we have to be careful to select which window frame our console is going to be sort of looking at. So there's a lot of different window frames in Glitch. Like there's a lot of embedded things built into the web page. The one that we're interested in is this one here that has the name of our sketch. Another way to find it is you can select by element here. So if I select an element, like I can click on my sketch here, it's going to highlight it in blue. And if I click on it, it's going to highlight that element in the code, but I can switch to the console here and I'll be on that correct element. So if we do this, we have access to our variables. Like you can see here, I'm typing URL. I can see this is my URL variable that's up here. We have access to variables. We have access to the variable data, which is a table, right? And we can see it contains some columns and some rows. We're going to explore that in a second. And in this view, I mean, we can even I think just draw some stuff into the window. Now that gets erased by the background black here immediately. So, but you could interact with your sketch directly from the console over here. Okay. So let's explore this data table. Okay. So data has a few functions to it. It has a function called getRowCount. Okay. Oh, shoot. Because I refreshed it, it switched me to the wrong. Let's go back here, make sure this is highlighted here. So the data table, right, we can see it has autocomplete as well in this little console. So this is like a little interactive JavaScript console where you can just enter in some code and play with your variables. So it can tell you the number of columns it has, right, the number of rows. That's going to be very useful when you try to iterate. So let's say get a row count, right? So we can see this table has 10 rows, right? And the way that we extract data from the table, now that we have it in this form, typically is going to be by going over the table one row at a time. Okay? So if I say data.getRow, I can pass in a parameter here. That's going to be the index of the row that I want to grab. So index 0 is going to give me the first row. Okay? So now we have a variable called row, which is a table row, right? And that variable contains some information as well. Okay? So we could say, we can see here it has its representation as an array. This is the row, it has green and the value. We can say get string. If we want to get the value contained as a string, we could say get string 0. That gives us the first column. We could say get string 1. That gives us the percentage as a string. Now this is a number, so I'm going to use the get number function to access that if I wanted to get it as a number. So you can see now it's being returned as a number. All right, so I like to use the console for things like this, just to kind of play around with the object. We're not really building our program here, but we get to explore a little bit and sort of see what functions are available, what kinds of things we can do with the object, and alongside with the documentation. This is a great way to get to know your variables a little bit better and just kind of try some things out there before you try to implement them in your actual code. Now, one thing that's a little annoying here, the way we set up the data, just jumping back to our spreadsheet here, is the only way we can refer to these columns is by indices. So in the spreadsheet, they're called A, B, C, and D, but in the CSV file, this is column 0, this is column 1. Oftentimes, it's really nice to be able to refer to the columns by a name so that our code can be a little bit more clear, and that's called a header. So if we add a row here at the top, our header is going to be a name that represents what the column is. So in this data, we might have color and percentage, right? So now the first row of our table is going to be the header. So it's not actually data. It's going to be just the name of the columns. So now that I've done this here, I can go back to my sketch. And when we load the table, we're going to add one more parameter that's going to say, actually, the CSV file has a header. And the way we do this is a little bit strange. This is how it was done in Java processing, and they've kind of followed the same format in the p5.js version, but they simply add another string here after CSV to indicate this table is going to have a header. It's just something to remember that we have to do. And now down here, if I was to look at the data, let's grab a row again. Let's get the first row. Okay. So now this row has a header. So now we could get number percentage, for example. And instead of having to use index 0 or index 1, right, we can refer to the columns by name. So that's going to be convenient. Or here we could get the color. Wait. Why doesn't this work? Interesting. Let's try a different name here. I hadn't tried that before. Let's go back here. Oh, okay. I made a mistake in my spreadsheet. You can see here, if I type columns, right, there's actually a space after color, so got to be a little bit careful with that. And it did not refresh because I didn't update the code. I accidentally put a space, so I'm going to make sure there is no space there. Okay, that was quite subtle. Let's refresh here. And let's say, okay, so now it's fixed. Now I should be able to say, give me the first row. And then from that row, give me a string for the column color. All right, that's more like it. Okay, back on track. So with that information, let's write a quick little sketch here that's going to extract the data from that table and then maybe create a little graphical representation of the data. Okay. So we could do this in setup. I'm going to do it in draw. It's going to just draw the same thing over and over, but it's no big deal. All right, so typically once we have a data object, a table object, we're going to want to iterate over its rows to do something with the data that it contains. So this is a great job for a for loop, right? We're going to create a for loop with a counter called I, and we're going to count from 0 to data.get rows. And we're going to do it in steps of 1. So get num rows is the number of rows that our table has, right? So it's kind of similar to the length of an array in that sense. And then inside the for loop, we can just get the row that we're interested in using our counter. So we're going to grab the row here using get row. And then we can have access to our data. So we can say, okay, well, let's see, the color, right, is going to be get string color. And then the percentage is going to be a number for the percentage column. And now we can try to do something with that information. Maybe we'll turn off the stroke, set a fill based on the color, and then we'll draw circles that are scaled according to this percentage value. Okay. So if we wanted to spread these across the screen, right, we could use our index value to help us map a series of x coordinates that are equally spaced. So we could say, let's calculate an x value. We're going to map the index of each row. That goes from 0 to the number of rows. And let's map this to a number between, let's say, 100 and width minus 100. Okay. Like so. And now we could draw a circle at x, height over 2, let's say, and 50. Let's just see that it works. Oh, I've got some errors up here. Did I use the right name of the function? Oh, it's the function is called get row count. Okay, my bad. Scratch that. So this should be get row count, and this should be get row count. Extra parentheses, delete those. Okay. What else? Oh yeah, okay. This should be row, not data. All right, there we go. And maybe we'll set a gray background so we can see that black was actually one of the colors or non-colors in this case from the survey, right? What do we have here? Oh, we have other as one of our data rows. Actually, this is kind of useless, so let's delete this row. I'm going to take that out of the data and going back to our sketch here, just to show how this is live updating. I'm going to refresh. And the spreadsheet should update itself. If I want to publish sheet 1, yeah, some changes have been made. Anyways, it might not be updating that quickly. So I think if we come back to it eventually, this other color should disappear. Okay. All right, so now the circles, they're all the same size, right? So we could imagine, actually this is mapped to get row count -1 if we want them to be properly spread out, right? Because the last value for the counter is going to be get row count -1, not get row count. And then the other thing we could do is we could say let's map, let's say 100 times p for the size. Make it a little bigger even. A little bigger. All right. So anyways, so this is taking a fixed value, right? And then multiplying it by whatever the percentage value was in the column. So we can see that these two are much larger than the other ones. And our other color has disappeared, right? So I think that's a factor of the changes we make on Google Sheets. There's a bit of a delay before they get republished. So that delay was pretty short. It was still under a minute, but if you make some changes and they don't appear right away, that's probably the reason why. Okay. Okay. So this is a really simple little example, but I wanted to start there just to show you what the workflow would be to get some data from a spreadsheet in p5.js. So let's recap briefly before we move on, right? So first we started with a spreadsheet. This could be any spreadsheet we have, and the data is always going to be, because it's a spreadsheet, in a table kind of format. So any data that fits into this kind of row and column paradigm is a good candidate to be loaded as a spreadsheet. So first we published the spreadsheet to the web, right? We published it to the web. We published only a single sheet as a comma separated value. And then this became our live spreadsheet. We could have also downloaded that file and uploaded it to our assets and then loaded it as an asset from the sketch. But since we're already, we're already using Glitch, which is a remote hosting for our programs, we are, dynamically loading p5.js here as a library on the web. We might as well open the spreadsheet as a URL. So that's what we're doing right here, putting the URL of the spreadsheet, using it as a parameter to load table. And then once we have our table, typically what we're going to do is iterate over it one row at a time. And then from that row object, extract the different data components that we want, whatever column we're interested in. And that can come into two forms, right? We can get the data as a string if it's text, or we can get it as a number if it's number data. So we have it in the correct format in order to use it inside inside our code. Okay. All right. Okay. So that's going to be it for this example. In the next example, we're going to build on that. We're going to do something slightly more complex. We're going to open a spreadsheet that has more rows, more elements than just the 8 or so that we're working with here. And we're also going to talk about working with data that has that contains coordinates, so things like latitude and longitude. So I'll see you in the next lesson.